Hi there, and welcome to Buddha Meets Jesus with me, Alan Zundell. This episode is going to be taking a slightly different direction from my previous episodes, although it's much in line with the intentions I have for this channel, as well as the connections between this channel and my other channel, Political Dharma. In Political Dharma, I was covering politics from the standpoint of non-major parties and independent candidates. And during the presidential campaign, I covered Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his vice presidential running mate, Nicole Shanahan, quite extensively. So every so often, now that the election is over, I will check in on the news, what's happening with Kennedy and what's happening with Shanahan, in case my viewers would like to know. Well, last week I checked up on them both, and in Shanahan's case, I did not see any news that was specifically political, but I did come across an interview she posted on her YouTube channel just a few days ago on the 9th. Today's the 12th, so that's about 3 days ago. And this was with a Christian who gives presentations around the country. Let me show you what it looks like here. This is Nicole Shanahan's YouTube channel, and she has this thing she calls Back to the People. The title of this particular episode is Christian Apologetics and the Case for Christ, featuring Wes Huff. Now, Christian apologetics does not mean apologizing for Christianity, although I'm sure some people would welcome that. It means defending Christianity and the Christian tradition, as at least as Mr. Huff understands it in this case. I've never heard of him before, but they did say in the description of the program that he was part of the conversation, or part of his expertise was the reliability of biblical manuscripts. So in Political Dharma, I said, that's what I found on Nicole Shanahan for that week, but I'll cover that in this channel because he's talking about something that I had been talking about, which is the Christian scriptures and how reliable they are. As it turns out, he didn't say anything in this interview about the reliability of Christian manuscripts, of biblical manuscripts, but he did talk about morality and its connection to politics and policy decisions, which is something I do talk about in my Political Dharma channel, but is also appropriate for this channel, because let me explain briefly the connection between the two channels. As I've been developing on Political Dharma, I do have an agenda in mind for reforming America or renewing America, whatever you call it. I call it Agenda for a New America, and it has some political aspects, especially reforming our electoral system to represent the public better, a economic program that I think would fix a lot of the problems that we experience under capitalism, and then finally a cultural program. And the cultural program has to do with giving a basis to the larger program that connects with the culture that we live in here in the United States of America, which has a very strong Christian strain as well as other influences. So there I present a cultural foundation that's not specific to Christianity or any other religion. It's very broad-based, and I'm hoping it's something that can not only tie into traditional American cultural values, including some Christian values, but also attract people from a wide variety of religious perspectives, whether atheists or secularists or people of other religious faiths, or even those who regard themselves as spiritual but not religious, with no foothold in any particular tradition, but maybe sampling from various traditions. So I was trying to create a program for the United States as it is today that ties into our traditional values. And I do have to address Christianity because that's an important part of Christian culture. So that's what I created this channel for, is to specifically hone in on the connections with Christian culture as I understand it, the Christian tradition as I understand it now, and the directions that I think we are going wrong. The influence of particular Christian views on our politics today, I think, is pernicious and dangerous. And this fellow, Wes Huff, expressed the kind of views that I think are like that. I don't think he himself is a pernicious or dangerous person. He seems very nice. He seems very earnest and thoughtful and truthful and well educated. But the viewpoint that he is sharing is one that I do not share and that I think is, in a way, he would not foresee something that is dangerous. All right. So, what I want to do is play a few clips from that interview and give you some commentary on it, tying it in to my larger project and why I think these kind of views are dangerous. So, it's a good example of the kind of Christian thinking that I think needs to be challenged. So, each of these clips is only a few minutes long, 3 or 4 minutes, and it comes out of a much longer show, an hour-long show. But I selected parts that I think are representative of his thought and the things he had to say, and also allow me to comment on particular points that he made. All right, so let's go into the first segment, and then I'll comment on it right afterward.
I think it's an issue of speaking into the culture of confusion that we exist in with clarity. And so I think there are certain touch points where you've highlighted, our culture is very concerned with ideas like virtue and ideas like justice and ideas like compassion. But if those aren't grounded in something that's objective, they often go awry. And so this is where you get kind of this skewing of these perspectives in what philosophically is sometimes referred to as planting your feet firmly in midair, in that we want to give credence to something like compassion. And so we look at, say, homeless people and we say, well, we need to be compassionate to them and we need to defend their right to be on the streets. And you can see that that sounds superficially compassionate, but then you look a little bit deeper and you're like, well, is that actually helping those people? Is that helping the people who are being affected in those communities by, tents being put up in their neighborhoods, or, children who have to go to the park and have homeless people who have tent encampments in the parks. And so what I, as a Christian apologist, want to speak to is, I am very concerned and very appreciative that the culture wants to give lip service to ideas like virtue and compassion and justice. However, I want to push our culture in saying, okay, where are you getting those ideas from? Where are you finding a foundation to actually ground those concepts? And by virtue of that grounding, how then is the logical conclusion of that worked out? Because so my friend Glenn Scrivener, who he heads an organization called Speak Life out in the UK, he puts it in a very articulate way when he says, when we say to secularists, where do you get your ethics or your morality from? Sometimes they look at us and they think we're asking whether they can be moral people. They say like, well, how dare you say I can't be moral? How dare you say I can't do good things or that I don't have ethics? And the way my friend Glenn puts it is he says it's the equivalent of saying, where did you get your pants from? We're not claiming you don't have pants on. We're saying, what was the store that you purchased them from? So if I say, where did you get your pants from? I mean, he's British, so he says trousers, right? Where did you get your trousers from? And they say, how dare you say I'm not wearing pants? I'm obviously wearing pants. You can see my pants right now. You say, no. It's not the question. Where did you get them from? Well, I'm obviously wearing them. So how dare you say? And so, this is kind of the back and forth we get into when we say, okay, the life of the unborn. Where are you grounding the virtue that gives the compassion to the mother from? Sometimes we look into our culture and we see the fact that they're very concerned with ideals that I think we as Christians can champion and say, I'm so glad you're concerned with justice. However, your perspective of justice doesn't seem to be either grounded in something objective or consistent throughout all the measures of justice. The grounding for those issues ultimately comes from the clarity of objective morality, which can only be grounded in, I would argue, an objective moral lawgiver like God. Because if we're going to say something is bad, we are therefore positing an objective good. And if we're saying there's an objective good, we're saying there's an objective law. And if we're saying there's an objective law, we're positing an objective moral lawgiver.
Okay, there you heard Wes Huff saying that he thinks he needs to speak into the culture of confusion we exist in with clarity, that we all need to do this. Speak into the culture of confusion with clarity in order to move it along in a more clear, logical, and well-grounded fashion. And what he regards as well-grounded means grounded in an objective morality. So far, a lot of that I agree with. The phrase objective morality, I do have questions about, as I will get to a little later, but that is a big thing in what he is talking about with her. Um, he says, unless moral concepts are grounded in something objective, they often go awry. He wants them to be rooted in some objective morality because he thinks otherwise we're going to go off the rails, off the track. And he raises the example of homelessness. And I frankly could not see any connection between objective morality and his discussion of policy towards the homeless. What he seemed to be talking about is just making a policy choice that achieved the objectives that are set out for it and questioning whether a particular policy direction is a good one. I agree with him really that putting up, making encampments for homeless people is not ideal and has a lot of bad side effects. What I think we should be doing is helping them get into houses, but that's hard to do because of budgetary concerns in the government. Not that I'm excusing it, I'm just saying it's a little harder to do. He doesn't talk about what he thinks the solution is, if it's just getting rid of encampments. But I didn't want to go into that issue per se. What I wanted to say is where's the morality in that? He doesn't really explain what he thinks Christian scriptures or objective morality, how you would apply them to this particular case. It seems like you're just starting out from a standpoint of general compassion, that you want to do something about this. You recognize it as a problem of human suffering. But what kind of policy is going to do it? So I didn't see much connection there between his thesis about being grounded in objective morality. He goes on to say, where do the ideas like that, compassion or justice or virtue, where do they come from? What's their foundations and how logical are our conclusions? That last part is what he's talking about with homelessness policy or unhoused people's policy, is whether we have logical conclusions. I was a public policy specialist as a political science professor, so I know a lot about policy evaluation, and I agree with him. It needs to be based on logic, also on evidence and comparisons and clarifying our objectives and other things. So it's a complicated subject. I'm not sure how he advanced that conversation in this particular example, or he used it as something to illustrate his point. He went on from there to say, he told a story about pants and how when you challenge secularists, they often take offense. When you ask them for the grounding of their moral views, they will take offense and say, well, you're saying I don't have any ethics? You heard what he said. He went on and he was mimicking how they would do this. He was exaggerating, of course, but I thought this was a case of presenting a opposing view, someone presenting an opposing view in a bad light, a negative light, because he is portraying this secular person as being so obdurate and stubborn that they could not really hear what he was saying or understand the meaning of his words. I assume because they are resisting his direction that he wants to take them, so they're got their back up against the wall, or that they can't defend their views, so they deflect to a different question. But he's showing them in a bad light and showing himself as the representative Christian apologist in a much better light, that he's reasonable, he's persistent, he tries to be very clear about what he's asking. I thought that was unfair. I thought that was characterizing your opponent in a bad light and you in a better light, but that is not at the heart of what I want to talk about. He went into abortion with that part that I clipped out where the little beep came to show that I removed the segment of this, and abortion policy. He went into all the things about, concern for the woman, concern for the developing human within the woman's womb, all that. But again, it didn't really show me anything about objective morality. His big thing is objective morality. All he was saying is that let's consider the child in the womb, if you want to use that language, as well as the mother's concern on it. You don't have to have any Christian background to think in those terms. It's mostly about a policy choice. It's not, he didn't explain what the objective morality was or how this was rooted in Christian scriptures or anything like that. So he goes on again and says after that beep, your perspective doesn't seem grounded in something or objective or consistent, speaking of this secular person, if you push them on it. And I would agree that's often the case, but it's also the case for a lot of Christians I know, maybe all the Christians I know, that it's not that what they grounded in is not really that objective, nor are there ways they apply it always consistent or logical. I would use, for example, the fact that scriptures are not objective. They can't be objective. You have to interpret words on a page. And of course, a lot of those words were already interpreted by people in translating them from Attic Greece of the first century to modern English. And depending on how well they do that, let's assume they do it well, you still got to interpret the scriptures. You got a variety of different books with a variety of different theological positions and a variety of different material in it. How do you find something objective there? It has to be subjective in the sense that you bring to the interpretation, you have to interpret it, and you bring to it your background knowledge and your values and your understanding of language and all that kind of stuff. So it's nothing objective about morality in the scriptures that I can see. There's a lot of discussion of morality. Sometimes it even conflicts, though, and sometimes it seems to be not very sound. So I don't know how he how he exempts himself from that or Christians in general. I don't see a grounding in something objective, whatever objective means, nor do I always see logical conclusions based on it. He talks about abortion again and the death penalty, so I cut that part out. And he says that the grounding comes from the clarity of objective morality, and that objective morality has to be found in, well, he talks about objective good and then objective laws, and then that leads to an objective lawgiver, which would refer to God. And then presumably the laws are outlined in the scriptures. I'm not sure where in the Ten Commandments of the, Jewish scriptures, maybe, but they're no more clear and free of interpretation than any other part of the Bible. And we certainly have scriptures from other traditions that have that take moral positions. I know in Buddhism there's the right speech, right action, right livelihood. So there is in that teaching morality, but what makes it objective? The fact that it's in a book or it's written down on a piece of paper. I don't think you can get from there to there. I think you can recognize things that are good in a general sense, and what we mean by that word, which goes back to the golden rule. I would say all people can understand the idea of treating other people as you would like to be treated yourself. That's not specific to Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition either, but I think most people would resort back to that. And that does not necessarily imply any kind of law. I think law is a metaphor for how in our usual world, a government will propound laws that are enforced on penalty of some kind of fine or punishment in some way. That's a metaphor. It's an allegory. It's saying that the sense of obligation we feel in our conscience or in our recognition that other people deserve some kind of good treatment is somehow a law. It's translated from this sense of what good may mean and how we could live out being a good person to the idea that there's an imposition from outside that we have to be like that and to spell it out exactly for us. That's a leap to get from there to there, I would say. And maybe he has a way to bridge that gap, but he didn't do it in this particular interview. All right, so there, I made several points about this leading up to some larger points, I hope. So before I go any further, let's hear a little more from what he had to say in response to a question by Nicole Shanahan.
You now have people trying to change the state's laws to move further and further away from the objective morals from which they were conceived.
the further we move away from, say, the roots that produced the modern Western society that we find ourselves in, the further, and not even necessarily the further we move away from it, but the more we try to disassociate from that foundation, the more we're going to find ourselves in trouble, because it's the equivalent of wanting the fruit while cutting the roots. And you can't divorce those things, right? The roots that drew the nutrients of ideas like ethics and virtue and um, you know, uh, uh, justice. Those come from a Judeo-Christian worldview, which is ultimately grounded in the objectivity of Christian scripture, right? The Old and the New Testaments. And we see this, and I think it's being granted by a number of kind of thinkers and historians today, chief of which comes to my mind, Tom Holland, not the actor who played Spider-Man, but the British historian who wrote the book Dominion. He has kind of chronicled these things. And then others, Douglas Murray, even Jordan Peterson, has kind of brought to light more of these ideas that, when we look at these concepts, where do we find their foundation? We find their foundation in the fact that the majority of Western society was built on these principles that come from a Christian heritage. And we've seen examples where we've tried to disassociate from those things following the Enlightenment in the 17th century, where we see things like the communist era and the USSR, where there was a test case in trying to eliminate religiosity in general. And what did that end in? Well, I heard someone say a few years ago that, when, what happened in the last few centuries? Well, the Enlightenment happened, where we relied on reason and we moved away from the old stuffy religiosity of traditional religion. Okay, well, what transpired then? Well, mostly genocide, chaos, and war. And, you see when you disassociate from that objectivity, what happens? Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had to import priests and pastors to simply instill morality into people, because in a 1984, George Orwellian-esque perspective, when you remove those ethics from society, it doesn't then gain a populace who can determine what is good and what is evil based on just consensus, and that works out for everyone. No, ultimately, it turns into a might is right perspective. And that's the danger in giving the government power that only God really has the ability to impart.
Okay, you heard Nicole ask the question about how our current laws and pushes for new laws are moving more and more away from objective morality. And he's agreeing with her and saying that the more we diverge from the Judeo-Christian roots of American culture, as he sees it, the less our laws will reflect that, and our behaviors will become less tied to morality, and there will be chaos. And he then goes on to this very odd argument about history and how the Enlightenment of Europe, when they started to turn towards rationality, and he regarded that as a turn away from religion, I guess. And he says this has ended up in the USSR and communism, and the whole problem of Russia and what happened in the USSR and the kind of abuses of government power had to do with trying to eliminate religiosity. He says this leads to genocide, chaos, and war. He went on even more so to talk about well, the only recourse, if you don't have this objective morality, is some kind of populist figure coming and saying they can determine what the social consensus is, but that leads to might makes right. And it almost sounds like if he didn't have that first part about a populist leader, I'm thinking of Donald Trump as well as Joseph Stalin. If you didn't have that, if you didn't have that, I could agree with him. No, I couldn't agree with him. Let me put this again. He talks about consensus, and I would think that's what a democratic society is about: is discussing and reasoning together, and then coming to consensus about what what kind of things we want to see happen and what the moral framework we're going to advance is. So sometimes that's implied in a policy and not fully out there in front of it, but that's what I would think democratic society is about. And this is where I think there's a problem. He is saying that if you're trying to do away with the moral foundations that come from religion, you're going to end up with a dictatorial figure. And the idea that law, as part of the arbitrary will of this powerful figure, is going to be totally detached from any morality and be something oppressive and come up with horrors. Okay, questions about this. Now, did the Enlightenment lead straight to the USSR? I don't think so. There's historical connections in thinking, but there's also historical connections between the Enlightenment and the United States and its form of government, not always free of chaos and war itself. So I don't see the direct connection between the Enlightenment and reasoning and USSR. And I would say that there are other explanations other than the attempt to do away with religion that were more plausible causes of what happened in the Soviet Union. One thing, I think there are deficiencies in the political theories and plans, strategies of Karl Marx, who was the inspiration for the people who took charge of Russia and then formed the Soviet Union. I would say what he did is helped justify a centralization of government power that was taken advantage of by a psychopath, Joseph Stalin, and that had to do a lot with bad political theory or inadequate political theory and a particular personality taking advantage of it. And he's not the first dictator in society, and a lot of them had Christian reasoning still today in different parts of the world. Dictators rely on, talking about traditional religion. And that's what I see as the thing that he doesn't see, is that how this kind of talk about objective morality being rooted in scriptures can lead people to utilize the ambiguity of scriptures to impose their own will on a public. And I think what he's setting up is the idea, not intentionally, but I think this is what it sets up, that you have to have a Christian viewpoint in order to govern properly, that you have to root yourself in the so-called objective morality of Christian scripture, which is so ambiguous that people can read just about anything they want into it, and that different views have formed about what it actually says. I think you're just setting it up to say there's a theocracy, there's an elite that can properly interpret the scriptures and come up with objective morality that applies to all of us, and then put that into practice. Now, it may not be a dictator. It may be that you have to spread Christianity far enough that they're actually making decisions in a democratic way based on these kind of moral foundations. But it just could easily as go against democracy by saying, when we leave it in the hands of the people and they do not have a sufficient understanding or appreciation of the Christian tradition. Look at the whole history of Protestantism as arguments unending about how to properly interpret the Christian scriptures. But there has to be a set of people that interpret it properly in their view. And if the democratic process is leading us in the wrong direction, well, maybe we need to turn against democracy and make sure we get people into power that can do this correctly. That's where I think this leads. So rather than a straight line from the Enlightenment to problems in the modern world, I see a straight line from theocracy, or from presenting a view that morality has to be founded in a religious scripture, into a theocratic kind of state that is not compatible with democracy. I'd also say that it's a very strange history that says that chaos, genocide, and what was the other thing he said? War came out of the Enlightenment and from the turning away from biblical values. I look back at the whole Christian era in Europe from the time that Constantine adopted adopted Christianity, and then it soon after became the official religion, all the way through the Middle Ages and the various kings and people who were ruling with a culture of Christian values and with the justification of preserving Christian values and basing things on Christian values and the Bible and the Scripture. That's not very pretty history either. For one thing, there was the 30 Years' War right after the Protestant Reformation, where there was warfare between Catholic states and Protestant states. Had a lot of causes, but certainly religion was feeding into a lot of that division because people could not agree on how to properly practice Christianity. So that was very bloody, and that was one of the most devastating wars in European history. Now, if they're implying that the United States of America is moving away from a Christian tradition that it previously held and we're going wrong because of that, I would ask, when did we go wrong? Because back when it was a primarily what most of the people in the country regarded themselves as Christians, Protestant Christians in particular, and a lot of political decisions were based on this kind of ideas about Christian morality that the folks had in that, say in the 19th century. Well, we had the genocide of Native Americans, we had slavery, we had the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history here on American soil. The only war on America, no, not the only one, the Revolution, War of 1812, we're also there, but a terrible war, a lot of suffering and death, a lot of chaos. Where is the proof that Christian societies are more immune from warfare and horrors and slaughtering people than non-Christian cultures? There are lots of societies throughout history that have not been Christian societies that did at least as well as Christian societies have in keeping peace and raising and having people cooperate and treat each other well. On the other hand, there's no difference that I can see in the propensity of societies to become bloody and being Christian or not Christian. I think I've made that case. History, he's got a strange history where all Christian societies are just wonderful and non-Christian societies somehow lead inevitably to horrible things. Okay, so much for that one. Now we're getting to the third and last one, and this is going to get to the meat of it. So let's play that, and then I will comment on that and give you some summing up.
How would I engage with helping people understand that there actually is something as real as objective morality? Like, how do you convince people of that?
Yeah, I think what I found very effective is simply asking clarifying questions. And the reason I have found that effective is because we live in a world where people are so ready to jump to the defensive. And especially when you're dealing with issues that are very tense, religion and politics, those are issues that traditionally, those are the ones you don't talk about around the dinner table at family events for a reason. Now, I think we've largely gotten ourselves into these problems because we haven't talked about religion and politics enough at family events. But that aside, what I've found effective is when people kind of throw out statements about, well, it's not kind to do X, or we need to fight for the right of A, or we need to, asking a clarifying question, really listening to people and saying, oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by compassion? What do you mean by justice? Oh, those conservatives, they think this. Okay, what do you mean by conservatives? And really helping people flesh out in their own mind what they actually are kind of trying to articulate themselves. Because a lot of the time I find people don't actually know. The way to stay out of the hot seat and yet remain in the driver's seat is to ask questions like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by logical? What do you mean by conservative? What do you mean by justice? What do you mean by compassion? And the second question is, how did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to the conclusion that it's illogical to believe in God? Because that will help how the conversation progresses. Because just as I found a lot of people have no idea what they mean by God or illogical, they also can't really give you a kind of articulate answer to how they came to that conclusion. Or you find out they're parroting something. they didn't actually come to that conclusion by themselves. They read Sam Harris. They read Richard Dawkins, or they watched a YouTube video of Matt Dillahunty. And they are just articulating something that they don't really have a comprehensive perspective about, but they thought sounded convincing. And, we're all guilty of this to some degree. We hear a pundit say something very convincing and we're like, oh, that sounds good. I'll repeat that later on.
Yeah.
And so, we need to also turn the mirror on ourselves and make sure that we actually likewise know what we mean by that and how we came to that conclusion. But I think that that's far more effective where we engage with the person rather than engaging with the argumentation. Because a lot of the time I've found that I've very rarely encountered wolves in sheep's clothing. A lot of the time I'm encountering people who they're also just kind of fumbling through this world, as am I. It engages with the person. It allows me to proceed knowledgeably upon the basis of what they actually believe. And so then I'm not attacking a straw man. And it kind of reduces the tension in the conversation because a lot of these conversations can be relatively tense.
Nicole asks him, how do you get people to understand that there is really an objective moral reality? And he never answers the question of how you get them to acknowledge an objective morality. But he does say that when he is speaking to people about these things, he finds it useful to ask clarifying questions and then listen carefully to their answers. Like, what do you mean by this term? What do you mean by that term? And he says people often don't know, and it's kind of confusing when they try to give their answer, and that helps them articulate it and make it more clear. Fine. I would say this is not a Christian tradition. This is the Socratic method that goes back to Socrates a few hundred years before Jesus was even born. Our American culture and our Western culture, in terms of morality, owes a lot more to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, than to the Judeo-Christian scriptures. It owes it to Aristotle. It owes it to the Stoics in Greece and in Rome. It owes it to Plato and Socrates. And that is the stuff that really formed our ideas about justice. And in fact, it was picked up by Christian philosophers after the scriptures were written in order for them to bring more reasoning into their theology and philosophy. They had to draw from the Greeks to help them sound more sensible and when they discussed these issues of morality. So that's the foundation. That's where it came from. It came via Christian tradition down through the centuries, but the origination of it was in Greek philosophy. And is he advancing that? I'm not sure what he thinks about that because he never even mentioned it. He's recommending the Socratic method without ever mentioning Socrates and Plato. I agree with them that a lot of times people do not have a good answer for what they mean by a term or, a logical reason for how they got to the conclusions they did. And then questioning can help. It can also be really annoying if you do it badly. And he says that, the part I cut out, I should say, is where he discusses whether belief in God is illogical, because people can't define God, people can't define logic. So he uses that as an example, but I cut that out because it was kind of longish. He says this is a way to stay out of the hot seat and stay in the driver's seat. I'm not sure what he meant by that. By hot seat, I guess he meant temperatures rising or that, but it sure sounded to me like he was saying he didn't want his values or beliefs questioned. He wanted to be in charge of the conversation. That's one way I could read that. I'm not sure if that's what he's meant, but that sure sounded that way to me. What would it be like actually to put him in the hot seat and ask those kind of questions? That's what I would love to be able to do. That's what I wanted to hear from him. What does objective morality mean? What do you mean when you say that? I don't hear you defining it. Does objective mean that it's clear to anybody who is able to see? Like it's not purely in our mind. It's objective like empirical evidence in front of us, or objective in the way that mathematics and logic can be seen as objective. Not everybody can follow that stuff, but once you've learned how to do it, then you can say, oh yeah, we all can see that's the way numbers work. That's the way logic works. So it's not objective Is it objective in those senses? Because I don't think that morality has ever been made that objective. It's not something we can all agree on. It's not something that is necessarily logical and clear to anybody who looks at it. So I think he's just parroting things, as he says, from other people he's read. Some of his arguments sounded very familiar from traditional Christian authors or from modern Christian authors. So I assume he's thought a lot of this through. He's been to college and he's been well trained and he's going around speaking and writing. So he must have given a lot of thought, but he never, in this interview, he talks a lot about objective morality, never defines what that means, never explains how we can see the scriptures as a source of objective morality, whatever that means. I do agree with him in the end that engaging with a person in this fashion, again, as long as you're not too annoying at asking persistent questions, rather than engaging with the person rather than with arguments is helpful because clarifying what you both mean is helpful. In my other video, I clarified what I regard as the sources of morality. And I think they're objective in some sense, but not in the kind of sense that he means it, that it's valid for all people for all time. I think, in essence, I said there was three sources of morality. One is a human capacity for insight into the commonality of all human beings, and in addition to other sentient beings. That doesn't really give you rules or laws. It just gives you a perception that you are inspired to act on, that, oh, they're like me, or we are one in some way. Part of the inspiration of morality. Another part is simply traditions that have grown up in a society for people to be able to get along with each other. That's objective in a anthropological sense, where you can say, well, I can see how the people are treating each other and the kind of, common behavior they have, and talk to them about what it means to them or what their moral views are. And that's objective in a sense, but it certainly is not objective in the sense that it's the same for everybody, everywhere, for all time. It's very culturally dependent. And the final source is just talking things through. This is the Enlightenment tradition, talking things through rationally and trying to come to common conclusions about morality. I don't think that project has worked out very well either, although some people have taken it in better directions, particularly Alistair McIntyre, who brings in Aristotelian perspective. Remember, Aristotle, he was a Greek before the time of Jesus, a few hundred years before the time of Jesus, and he talked about starting from a standpoint in which your culture accepts certain virtues and certain types of moral beliefs, and then you question them and then try to bring them closer. So he's using, again, a type of Socratic method, just like Mr. Huff is recommending, and which I would like to see applied to his ideas as well. So, long story short, I think I've told you what I think is dangerous about this trend of thought is the idea that the world is going to hell in a handbasket if you don't have an objective morality, and that morality in our world has to be rooted in the lawgiver of God, in what he put inspired in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Because they're so ambiguous, it's dangerous. And people who think we need to find that kind of objective morality, I don't think understand the real grounds of morality, or at least I disagree with them on it. So there's a better way. I don't think you have to be a Christian. I don't think you have to rely on Christian scripture. That's the wrong direction. The right direction is, if you want to understand Christianity, go more deeply into it and ask yourself, how did Jesus really see things, and how did it evolve over the centuries in the ways that it has, so that we can get back to some of the deeper insights into it, and not some kind of superficial reading of scripture. There, I'm characterizing his views in a way that's very negative rather than be more charitable. So I kind of get out of it the way he does, which is some people strike me as having that tact. Thanks for watching. I'll be going back to the scriptures, I think, for my next show on this channel. I'll be talking about what we can learn about Jesus from Paul, the apostle, who lived closer to the time of Jesus than the people who wrote the Gospels. And then from there, going on to, I think, some comparisons between Buddhism and Jesus and Christianity again, and then give you my view of who Jesus was as kind of a framework after I've already discussed some of the grounds for what we can know about Jesus. That's in the future, and I hope you come back to comment on some of those as well. Comments, likes, shares, all appreciated. Check out my other channel, Political Dharma, and that's it for now. Bye.